Hello, everybody. My name is Pablo Boczkowski. I am a faculty member at Northwestern University and the director of the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Thank you so much for joining us for today's weekly virtual seminar of the Center. It is really a pleasure to have you with us. The mission of the Center is to create knowledge about digital media in Latinx and Latin American communities across the Americas. And today's speaker is a leading scholar in this space. Professor Alcides Velasquez is an assistant professor in the Communication Studies Department at the University of Kansas. Mariana Sanchez Santos, a doctoral candidate at American University and an affiliate of the Center for Latinx Digital Media, will introduce Alcides in just a minute. I am delighted to note that this quarter our series is co-sponsored by the Alice Kaplan Institute for the Humanities, the Buffett Institute for Global Affairs, the Center for Global Culture and Communication, the Department of Communication Studies, the Department of Radio, Television and Film, and the Program in Latin American and Caribbean Studies. But before we go into the seminar, I would like to start by acknowledging that Northwestern is a community of learners situated within a network of historical and contemporary relationships with Native American tribes, communities, parents, students, and alumni. It is also in close proximity to an urban Native American community in Chicago and near several tribes in the Midwest. The Northwestern campus sits on the traditional homelands of the people of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Odawa, as well as the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. It was also a site of trade, travel, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other native tribes and is still home to over 100,000 tribal members in the state of Illinois. It is within Northwestern's responsibility as an academic institution to disseminate knowledge about native peoples and the institution's history with them. Consistent with the university's commitment to diversity and inclusion, Northwestern works towards building relationships with Native American communities through academic pursuits, partnerships, historical recognitions, community service, and enrollment efforts. Let me say briefly a little bit more about how the seminar will unfold. First, Mariana will tell us more about Alcides' research and career in just a minute. Then Alcides will present his work. After that, we will open for questions. Please enter your questions in the Q&A function of the webinar at the bottom of the screen. Enter them at any point in time during the seminar. After Alcides finishes his remarks, Mariana will read them aloud and will moderate the Q&A. At the end, we will deliver some closing remarks. Once again, many thanks for joining us. And without further ado, Mariana, the screen is all yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Pablo. Well, it is my honor to introduce Professor Velasquez. Professor Velasquez holds a PhD in Media and Information Studies from Michigan State University. Currently, he is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Kansas. His research focuses on understanding social and political participatory uses of communication technologies, such as political expression and activism on social media, and their individual and collective outcomes. He also studies digital divide and how access can have beneficial outcomes in disadvantaged population context. Today, he will talk about Latinx social media political expression as collective or corrective action. Professor Velasquez, welcome to the seminar. The screen is all yours.
Thank you very much, everyone. I really appreciate. I'm grateful for your invitation. I'm really happy to participate today in the seminar and to be presenting my research. As Mariana said, my name is Alcides Velasquez. I'm an assistant professor in the Communication Studies Department at the University of Kansas. I have been here at KU for 5 years now. And today I'm going to be sharing with you the research that I have been working on for the past 4 or 5 years. I'm going to share my screen now and begin my presentation. Okay, so the title of my presentation today is Latinx Social Media Political Expression as Collective or Corrective Action. Before I start with my presentation, I would like to share with you a little bit of my research in general, my intellectual approach to research. So one of the areas that I'm interested in studying is social media. From the very beginning, one of the reasons why I became a researcher was trying to understand social media use and how social media as a technology, as an emergent technology, both internet and social media, would influence personal relationships, how we connected with each other, and in more broader terms, how it would shape or influence society and politics in particular. So that's the first area of research that I'm interested in, trying to understand how people use social media and the social and political implications of that use. The second area of interest to me is political communication, especially as it connects with social media use. I'm interested in understanding how information consumption on social media or news consumption on social media is related with political participation or political uses of social media, how people use the information they consume to share their views and opinions on these type of platforms, or how social media might lead to new forms of political participation, or traditional forms of political participation, such as voting. So in my research, in my first research, I connected both social media and political communication, looking at particularly social media political expression or political uses of social media. And the other area of research that I'm interested in is the US Latinx population. For the past 4 or 5 years since I moved here to Kansas and I became a professor here at KU, I started looking at the Latinx population in the US as it related to their social media use and their political uses of social media, trying to understand how information consumption on social media may lead to increased levels of political participation among these minority population in the US. I moved to the US in 2017, and that coincided with the presidency of Donald Trump, and that kind of inspired me to look at the position of the Latinx population and their political participation and their presence on social media. So most of my research is at the intersection of these three areas. And my latest research seeks to understand Latinx's social media political expression, both at the individual and the collective level. So why my interest in the Latinx population in the US? First, as I mentioned, I moved to the US when Donald Trump first became president. And you might be familiar with the rhetoric that he used referring to members of the Latinx community. Also, the immigration policies that he implemented and tried to advance kind of moved me towards trying to see how the Latinx population reacted to these climate of opinion that was adverse to their own interests. But also, in a larger picture, the Latinx population has become the largest minority group here in the US. 19% of the population identify as member of the Latinx community. Actually, according to data from the U.S. Census Bureau in the census that they did back in 2020, 2021, the Latinx population growth in the U.S. During the last decade accounted for more than 50% of the overall growth of the U.S. population. So we can say that basically the U.S. population is growing in part due to the growth of the Latinx community. And according to also to data from the U.S. Census Bureau and Pew Research, around 80% of members of the Latinx community are U.S. citizens. So, you know, the combination of seeing these community members of the Latinx community as the largest minority group with increased political power as they can now vote and participate in elections, kind of highlights the importance that this minority group has for politics here in the U.S. The other aspect that interests me about the Latinx population is that they are the immigrant roots that they have. 1 in 3 members of the Latinx community are immigrants. 42% of self-identified Latinos report discrimination experiences for being Latinx. So while there are a large minority group in the US right now, still we see some type of discrimination because of their origin, because of their immigrant roots. And as a matter of fact, around 39% of Latinx, of the Latinx population express concern about either them being deported or someone they know, someone from the family or someone that they are close with. So we see the Latinx population becoming increasingly important in the political life of the U.S., but at the same time, they're still in a position of marginalization in U.S. society because of their immigrant roots, or because of their identity as Latinos. Interestingly, though, we have seen how Latinos have increasingly become more engaged in politics. Traditionally, members of the Latinx population have been at the margins of political life in the US. They, in general, don't tend to vote. But during the last years, if you notice, starting in 2016, we have seen how the gap between those who vote and those who register to vote has started to close. And now more than 50% of the electoral of the Latino electorate actually engage in this type of political participation in voting. So as we see that voter registration and election participation trends among Latinx have been changing, so that Latinx have become more interested in politics and more active in political participation, I thought that I am interested in looking at is social media playing any role in this latest interest? One potential explanation could be that I haven't explored is that maybe we are in general seeing more voter engagement. The last elections was an example of that. The 2020 elections were an example of that, where we saw record-breaking participation in general in the U.S. population. And one potential explanation is because of the increased polarization that we see in society right now in the U.S. That could be a potential explanation for the increased participation that we see among members of the Latinx community. I take a different route and I look at social media collective expression as one potential emergent type of political participation that might be, I haven't explored this yet, but it might be leading to increased levels of political participation. So in my research, I have used three theoretical approaches. The first one, I have used social cognitive theory, particularly the concept of efficacy, both self-efficacy or what I call social media efficacy, or the other concept is collective efficacy. So I have looked at both social media political efficacy and collective efficacy among the Latinx population, trying to understand how it relates with increased patterns of social media expression, political expression on social media, and political participation. I've also applied the theory of corrective action, which is related with hostile media perceptions and third-person effects perceptions of the media. I will explain a little bit more in detail how corrective action, how I use or apply corrective action in studying social media expression, political expression. And the other theoretical approach that I have been using is social identity, how identification as Latino, in-group identification, might be leading to increased levels of political participation and particularly social media political expression. So these are the three theories that my research advances, and in general my research tries to contribute to these three theories. Social cognitive theory, particularly the concept of efficacy, perceptions that people can, through their own actions, influence and change their political environment. Collective efficacy, perceptions that the group that people belong to can achieve their objectives through political action. Corrective action, which result from perceptions of media bias or hostile media perceptions, and social identity or in-group identification, and how those can also lead to expression on social media. So let me share with you very briefly a couple of studies that I have published and that have kind of influenced or led me to the study that I will be focusing more on today. So the first one is this study on ethnic minorities, social media, political use, and how in-group identification, selective exposure, and collective efficacy can explain social media political expression. So in this study, what we tried together with two colleagues from the University of Kansas. One of them is now at the University of Oklahoma. She was a grad student when we were doing this study. How we wanted to look at how different dimensions of in-group identification might lead to social media political expression. So we were wondering if it was perceptions of common and shared experiences and the emergence of group characteristics in the definition of the self. So how much people perceive that other Latinos, other members of the Latinx community shared a lot in common, shared the same experiences, and how also people, the participants in the study, perceive themselves as prototypical members of the Latinx community. So was that dimension of in-group identification the one that we call self-definition, the one that that explains social media political expression, or was it feelings of belonging and connection with other individual members of the Latinx community, what explains social media political expression? So we wanted to understand if it was more feelings of belonging, being members of, having Latinx friends, having close connections with other members of the Latinx community, or was it how I perceive myself and other members of the Latinx community in terms of sharing the same experiences and having common characteristics, what explained social media political expression about two issues, about immigration and expression about Latino culture on social media. And what we found was that it was the first dimension, self-definition in terms of group membership. As Latinx members felt that other members of the group shared common characteristics and experience, and also how they thought about them being prototypical members of that group. As that increased, as that dimension of identification increased, their expression on social media about immigration and Latinx culture also increased. Interestingly, we found that perceptions of collective efficacy conditioned the relationship between identification in terms of self-definition and social media expression about immigration. So especially among those who perceived that Latinx could, together as a group, acting together, could achieve what they wanted in terms of political change. Among those, the relationship between self-definition, in-group self-definition, and social media expression about immigration was stronger. The other study that I wanted to share with you as a precursor to the study that I'm working on right now and that I'm going to be presenting today is this one on social media expression as a collective strategy, how perceptions of discrimination and group status shape US Latinos online discussions of immigration. So in this study, we wanted to look at how group status impermeability and perceived discrimination led to social media expression about immigration. So group status impermeability refers to how group members perceive that given a threat to their identification, given a threat, how much they can perceive that they can change groups, either change groups, or that they can, as members of that group, have access to the same resources that higher status group has access to. So we looked at how much members of the Latinx community perceive that given a threat, how much they could change groups, how much they thought that they could pass as white Americans instead of members of the Latinx community, and how much perceived discrimination, perceiving that they have been discriminated or that Latinos have been discriminated, how both increased their expression on social media. And what we found was that as Latinx perceive that their in-group is discriminated, as they perceive that they are discriminated against, and that there are very significant or important obstacles to change their group status. So as they perceive that they cannot leave their group, that they cannot pass as white Americans, they are more likely to use social media to express their views and share information on issues of import to their group, particularly in the case of this study, immigration. So in this study, we found that perceptions of discriminations against Latinos and perceptions that those members of the participants in this study, members of the Latinx community, couldn't change groups, basically couldn't de-identify as Latinos, that led to increased levels of social media political expression about immigration particularly. But in these two studies, the variable that I wanted to explain was social media political expression as an individual reported behavior, as a reported behavior, right? So I was looking at how these participants use social media for political expression at the individual level. The definition that I used in this study for social media political expression was from another study that I published earlier that defines social media political expression in terms of political communication behaviors on social media that express a specific opinion or emotion on current political events and processes, or behaviors that disseminate information relevant for the interpretation of those events and processes. In other words, these variable that I used in these two studies did not tackle something that I am very interested in, which is behaviors, political behaviors at the collective level, behaviors that people pursue as members of a group. In this case, Latinx. So one of the things that I wanted to understand was, are these people behaving, posting on social media as individuals or as members of the Latinx community? And that led me to think about social media collective expression as a new concept that I wanted to study. So I adapted social media collective expression using the definition of collective action, and I defined social media collective expression in terms of expressive social media behaviors performed by group members in order to improve the group status. So those are behaviors that people perform as group members in order to achieve change, and to achieve change not for the individual, but for the group they belong to achieve change that is going to improve the social status of their group. So in the study that I'm going to be talking more about today is a study that defines social media political expression as a collective action strategy performed by members of the Latinx community as they perceive a threat to their social identity. So let me explain this a little bit more. In this study, I take an approach using two theories, social identity theory and corrective action theory. So from social identity theory, we know that we seek positive distinctiveness from the group, from our group membership. So we usually identify with different types of groups, and when we identify with groups, we want to feel that a group membership as something positive, as something that we actually think that is worth belonging to, right? So when we see that that our social identity is threatened, when there's a threat to our group, we usually pursue, there are two potential strategies that we can use to cope with those threats. We can follow either individual strategies or collective strategies. Individual strategies are those that basically end up with people either decreasing their identification with the group or completely leaving the group, right? So when people feel that the group they belong to is under threat, think, for example, you are a fan of a football team, and your team is always losing. It's the last one on the table. That's a typical social identity threat. What do? Do you cope with that social identity threat at the individual level or at the collective level? In other words, do you decrease your identification as a fan of that football team, or do you just go and try and find another team, or do you follow a collective strategy to deal with that threat to your identity? The collective strategies that people can use can be either social creativity or social competition. And collective action is one of those strategies, which is social competition. So collective action is one of those strategies because it seeks to subvert the disparities in social status, power, or access to different resources present in society. So when people follow collective action behaviors as members of a group, what they seek to do is change the hierarchies or the social status of the group so that their group they belong to actually can gain status or move up in the social hierarchy. So collective action is one of those collective strategies that group members pursue so that they can improve the distinctiveness from their group membership. The other theoretical approach that I take here is corrective action theory, which is connected with perceptions of media bias. So this corrective action theory is rooted on third-person effects and hostile media perceptions or perceptions of media bias. And basically, what corrective action theory argues is that when we perceive that the media is biased against us, we seek to correct the information that the biased media is spreading. We seek to correct that information by intervening in the public sphere. So usually the corrective actions that we take is that we engage in political conversation, in political talk, as a reaction to what we think is a negative coverage or a biased coverage by the media that opposes our views or that opposes our group. So these actions, as I said, are aimed at correcting or avoiding the potential negative consequences that a biased media might have as they cover negatively information, what we perceive as negative, or that opposes the views that we have, the political about a particular issue, our political views about a particular issue. So these hostile media perceptions or perceptions of media bias are in part based on in-group identification. From the very first study back in 1989, I believe, Baloney et al. Found that partisans perceived that the media was biased against them, even though the content was objectively neutral. So it can be the case that perceptions of media bias is a phenomenon that can be understood in terms of social identification. The more we identify as liberal, the more we identify as conservative, the more we are going to perceive that the media is biased against our group. At the beginning of these studies of this theory of research on perceptions of media bias, people thought that maybe it was that it was more connected with the attitudes and the opinions that people had about certain issues, but increasingly we have seen how these perceptions are tied to how much we identify with particular groups. In the first study of hostile media perceptions or perceptions of media bias, Baloney used members of Palestinian students and Israeli students as they were exposed to content about the conflict and about this conflict, and they found that it was this group membership what led to perception of media bias. And this is something that I have looked at in other studies, finding that increased in-group identification may lead to perceptions of media bias, suggesting that there's some type of group membership or in-group identification mechanism going on, explaining perceptions of media bias. So corrective actions may be construed or interpreted as a collective action driven by the social identity threat that the biased media pose. So basically, I'm synthesizing social identity theory and corrective action theories, arguing that these perceptions of media bias can be, on one hand, explained in terms of in-group identification, but also that those perceptions of media bias are one type of social identity threat. And as we perceive this social identity threat, we first, based on corrective action, seek to correct the wrongs that a biased media might pose. And first and second, it's a strategy, it's a collective action strategy that we might pursue because we feel our social identity under threat. Our group is under threat, so we react using corrective action or a collective action. So the theoretical model that I am going to be presenting today suggests that exposure to in-group information and news on social media will lead to perceptions of media bias. I should say perceptions of negative media bias. So the more I consume or see information on social media about my group, in this case, members of the Latinx community, the more I will believe that the media is biased against my group. But that relationship, I argue, should be conditioned by in-group identification. This relationship should be stronger for those who identify more as members of the Latinx community. So those who identify more with the Latinx community are going to perceive that the media is negatively biased against Latinos more strongly. And these perceptions of media bias will lead to increased social media collective expression. So the more I believe that the media is biased against Latinos, the more I will use social media to achieve the changes for Latinos. The more I will use social media to improve or to help Latinos get the status in society that I believe they deserve. And also, I test the direct relationship between exposure to in-group information and news on social media and social media collective expression as conditioned by in-group identification. So the data that I used to test this theoretical model was collected back in 2020 in October, a little bit before the 2020 elections. I used a stratified quota sampling technique using age, gender, US region, language spoken at home, income, and education as criteria for the quotas. And the sample characteristics, we had 995 social media users in this study, 62% females. In general, the characteristics of the sample resemble the characteristics of the Latinx population in the US, except for gender and for age, because the Latinx population in the US, the average age is lower. So let me share the results with you now. We found that exposure to in-group information and news on social media did not lead to perceptions of media bias, and this relationship was not, or rather, I did not find that in-group identification conditioned the relationship between exposure to in-group news and information and perceptions of media bias. So the first hypothesis was not supported. However, the second hypothesis was supported. Perceptions of media bias increased social media collective expression. So the more individuals perceived that the media was biased against Latinos, the more they use social media for collective action, for collective expression. Now, I also had a hypothesis testing the conditioned mediation. So I basically tested how perceptions of media bias mediated the relationship between exposure to in-group information and social media collective expression as conditioned by in-group identification. And I found that indeed in-group identification conditioned the mediation. I found evidence of a conditional indirect effect. As you can see here, as in-group identification increased, the mediation, or the indirect effect became stronger. So for those who had an average in-group identification as Latino, or for those who had high levels of identification as Latino, the effect was stronger compared to those who had lower levels of identification. As a matter of fact, those who didn't identify as Latino, but rather identified less as members of the Latinx community, the mediation was not significant. So for those who identify less as members of the Latinx community, exposure to in-group information did not lead to perceptions of media bias, and that did not lead to social media collective expression. But for those who identified more as members of the Latinx community, only for those, exposure to information about their group led to perceptions of media bias, and those perceptions led to social media collective expression. And in terms of the conditioned direct relationship, we found evidence that indeed in-group identification moderated this direct relationship, but this relationship was opposed to the one that I initially hypothesized. What I found here was, and as you can see here, is that in-group identification decreased, the direct effect of exposure to in-group information and news on social media collective expression became weaker. So while the effect is significant for all for high identifiers and low identifiers, the evidence shows here that the direct effect is stronger among those who identify less as members of the Latinx community. And I had hypothesized that this was going to be the case, but the opposite. What I had hypothesized was that in-group identification for those who identified more as members of the Latinx community, the effect was going to be stronger. So overall, my model explained 31% of the variance in social media collective expression in this sample. Now, what are the implications of these findings? So we can conclude that among Latinx, for members of the Latinx community, in-group news exposure does lead to perceptions of media bias, or rather, the way I should explain it is more like, among the Latinx population, in-group news exposure leads to social media collective action, social media collective expression through perceptions of media bias. But this mechanism only operates among those who identify more as members of the Latinx community. So those who identify strongly as Latinos, as members of the Latinx community, as they are exposed to information on social media, they will use social media for collective action and for collective expression through perceptions of media bias. So increased exposure leads to perceptions of media bias, that the media is biased against my group, and that will end up in individuals using social media, members of the Latinx community using social media to try to change that, to try to change their perceived lower social status that Latinos have through social media. Also, we found that low in-group identifiers will engage in social media collective expression as a direct result of in-group news exposure. This means basically that high and low Latinx in-group identifiers, those who identify strongly as Latinos and those who identify less as Latinos, but still consider themselves Latinos, are going to interpret media content or in-group news content differently. For those who identify strongly as members of the Latinx community, that is going to lead to perceptions of media bias, which will lead to collective action. And those who identify less as members of the Latinx community, as they are perceived to information and news on social media, that is going to still lead to social media collective expression, but not as a result of perceptions of media bias. It's not going to be a result of corrective action, but just collective action. Whereas for those who identify strongly as members of the Latinx community, we can interpret their social media collective expression as both a corrective action and as a collective action. At the theoretical level, we can conclude that social media collective expression can be a type of collective action that results from perceived social identity threats construed in terms of perceived media bias. And the social identity threat does take the form of perceived media bias, confirming the evidence that suggests that perceptions of media bias and corrective action overall can be explained in part in terms of social identification mechanism, or having an underlying social identification mechanism going on. In terms of future work, I would like to integrate this research, social identity, corrective action with social cognitive theory. As I said, particularly the concept of collective efficacy, perceptions that my group can achieve what they want, its goals and objectives by acting together. And also, I would like to take a look at the prevalence of media coverage of Latinx, particularly about the issue of immigration, and in general how Latinx are currently covered by media, both media in Spanish and in English, to try and see how we can explain those perceptions of media bias on one hand, and how these media might lead to different or these different media exposure might lead to different outcomes in terms of social media collective expression. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to having an interesting discussion about this research. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor. This was a very important, interesting, and timely research. I think we're going to have time for one question, so I'm going to give the floor to Mora. Mora, are you there?
Yes, I'm so sorry. I couldn't connect my camera. Thank you so much, Alcides, for this presentation. I was really interested in the concept of collective social media expression. And my question is the following. When people put their messages out there in social media, they're doing it individually, and they are facing many different imagined audiences that have an impact of the way in which they express themselves. So my question is, how can we actually define whether people are individually or collectively addressing messages, and whether or maybe I can ask, what's the impact of the different imagined audiences that people have in mind when they are talking to others and expressing themselves in terms of a collective group. Because again, we can see very clearly how a person that has a group in Twitter that, has an account that is popular and has many different users containing that account, I can see how that is collective, right? If I have an account that's Latinos in the US and I post from that account, then I see how that is actually collective. But if I have an individual person with an individual account and I see how this person imagines different kinds of audiences, how is this person, when do we know that this person is collectively addressing these other audiences, or when is it individual? That's my question. It's a question maybe of conceptualization and operationalization also. Thank you.
So that's a great question, and it's a very good point about this idea of imagined audience and how people, as they post on social media, they create an image of who they think are going to see the content that they're posting. The way in which I measured social media collective expression in this study was in terms of asking participants how likely they were to share. Like, I'm going to give you examples of items that I included in the measurement. One of them was share with your social media contacts content posted on other pro-Latino Hispanic social media applications or pages. Share a comment posted by someone else denouncing discrimination against Latinos or Hispanics. Post news denouncing discriminatory treatment against Latinos or Hispanics, or invite others to express views in support of Latinos, Hispanics. Now, one way in which some studies make sure that they're asking whether people are following these behaviors individually or as group members is by asking them, as a member of, or so for example, as a Latinx, how likely are you to versus you, how are you likely to do X or Y? So that's one way in which in surveys I have seen people tackle this issue of, what identity is more salient, my individual identity or my social identity. But I think that, the issue of imagined audience and collective expression, whether as group member or as an individual, that's something that warrants further study, and how, what role does imagined audiences play in thinking about, in deciding whether or not to post something first, and second, as a group member or as an individual. Things that other variables that I think could potentially play a role here could be, how I perceive my social network is composed in terms of in-group membership. So do I think that that I'm followed, or that my connections in social media are mostly Latinx or not? How do I consider, my social network composition on social media? That's a variable that could potentially aid in trying to understand whether, who people think they're talking to on social media might make it more collective or individual behavior. Thank you. Great question, and great to see you.
Yes, Alcides, it was great to see you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Alcides, for a great presentation. It was super well done and very interesting findings and implications. Thank you, Mariana, so much for great moderation as always. Thank you to our audience for staying with us through the end. And I invite everybody to join us for next week's iteration of our seminar at the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Thank you very much, Alcides, again.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Mariana.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you.